Professor Quibblix adjusted his 4 spectacles and cleared all 3 of his throats as he gazed upon his meticulously organized lecture hall. The classroom at Galactic University was his sanctuary, his domain of absolute intellectual authority. The hovering desks were arranged in perfect concentric semicircles, and his teaching podium gleamed with the polish he'd applied himself that morning. Another glorious day of enlightening young minds, he mumbled to himself, his green scales shimmering under the artificial lighting. And today, my favorite lecture of all. Professor Quibblix was the galaxy's foremost expert on mythological species, or so his self-published academic biography claimed. His course, Fantastical Beings, separating fact from fiction, was legendary across 7 star systems, but no module brought him more delight than today's topic: humans. Ah, humans, he chuckled, sorting through his holographic slides. The most absurd creation in all of galactic folklore. The classroom began filling with students of various species. There was Zorn, his prized pupil, a gelatinous blob who absorbed knowledge almost as efficiently as he absorbed nutrients through his permeable membrane. Beside him floated Trixna, whose 14 eye stalks were perfect for taking notes from multiple angles simultaneously. In the back sat Gloop and Plex, the trouble-making binary twins who shared one brain between their 2 bodies. "Attention, class," Professor Quibblix announced, his voice modulator turned to authoritative scholarly mode. "Today we delve into the most preposterous entry in our catalog of mythological species. More unlikely than the vacuum-breathing stellar whales of Rigel 7. More fantastical than the supposedly sentient math equations of the Pythagorean nebula. Today we discuss humans." A wave of amused tittering rippled through the classroom. Humans were everyone's favorite mythological species. They were just so absurdly impossible. Let us review what ancient texts claim about these creatures. Quibblix continued, activating his first holographic slide. Supposedly native to a Class 3 death world they call Earth. Yes, they allegedly named their planet Dirt. Humans are described as bipedal endoskeletal beings with only 2 eyes, 2 arms, 2 legs, and a laughably inefficient single-pump circulatory system. Zorn raised a pseudopod. "Professor, is it true they're made mostly of water and can only survive in a ridiculously narrow temperature range?" "Excellent question, Zorn. Indeed, the myths claim these creatures are primarily composed of water and require temperatures between 263 and 310 Kelvin to survive. Any colder, they crystallize. Any warmer, they denature. Utterly ridiculous for a supposedly dominant species." Professor Quibblix was hitting his stride now, his scales flushing to a deeper green with academic excitement. "But wait, it gets better," he warbled gleefully. "These mythical humans allegedly sleep. Yes, become completely vulnerable and unconscious for 1/3 of their absurdly short lifespans. They have no natural armor, no claws, no venom, no inherent connection to quantum fields, not even basic telepathy. Yet somehow, ancient texts claim they became the dominant species on their planet and eventually reached the stars." The class erupted in laughter. Even by mythological standards, humans were a stretch. Professor called out Plex, or possibly Gloop. It was hard to tell which twin was speaking. "What about the stories that humans can ingest toxins for pleasure?" "Ah yes, the classic myths about alcohol and capsaicin. Allegedly, humans willingly consume compounds that damage their internal systems because they enjoy the sensation. Next, you'll be telling me you believe they have emotional attachments to non-sentient organisms and keep them in their dwellings." Quibblix's 3 throats all laughed at different pitches, creating a harmonic chord of academic derision. Just as Professor Quibblix was about to display his extensively annotated diagram of the obviously inefficient human digestive system, his office communicator buzzed. He frowned all 7 of his mouth parts and checked the message. "Dean Vroxis requires my attention momentarily. Begin reading Chapter 47 on human reproductive practices, which, I assure you, are even more preposterous than their digestive processes. I shall return shortly." He slithered out into the hallway where Dean Vroxis, a towering crystalline being, was waiting. "Ah, Professor Quibblix, just the educator I was seeking," the dean resonated, light refracting through her crystalline form. "I've come personally to inform you of a most fortuitous development. The Galactic Exchange Program has selected our university to host 3 new students. They arrive tomorrow and will be joining your classes immediately." "How wonderful," Quibblix replied with minimal enthusiasm. New students meant new mouths to correct and new minds likely filled with non-peer-reviewed nonsense. "May I ask from which system these students hail? I do hope they're not Mercurians. Their constant phase shifting during lectures is most disruptive." Dean Vroxis's crystalline form glittered with what seemed like barely contained excitement, or possibly anxiety. Well, that's the truly remarkable part. They're from Sol 3. The exchange application listed them as human. Professor Quibblix stared blankly, all four eyes blinking out of sync. I beg your pardon, human, as in the mythological species I am literally teaching about at this very moment. Dean Vroxis, if this is some form of academic humor. No joke, Professor. Apparently humans are quite real, have achieved interstellar travel, and are eager to participate in cultural exchange. The Galactic Council simply classified their system as developing until now. Quibblix's scales rapidly cycled through a rainbow of colors before settling on a sickly yellow. But my entire lecture module, my published papers, my upcoming book, Humans, the galaxy's most persistent myth, it's at the publisher now. Yes, well, the dean's voice resonated uncomfortably. Perhaps you'll need to prepare a revised edition. In any case, I expect you to welcome these exchange students with the full dignity of Galactic University. They will be attending your class first thing tomorrow morning. As Dean Vroxis crystallized away, Professor Quibblix slumped against the wall, all three of his hearts palpitating arrhythmically. He had built his entire academic reputation on debunking mythological species, with humans as his crowning example of folkloric absurdity. And tomorrow, if the dean was to be believed, three of them would be sitting in his classroom while he explained why they couldn't possibly exist. Professor Quibblix's scales settled on a deep mortified indigo as he prepared to return to his lecture. Today was suddenly feeling far less glorious than he'd anticipated. Professor Quibblix barely slept that night, which for his species that required only 17 minutes of sleep in a hibernation pod, was truly saying something. He'd spent his evening frantically researching, scouring the galactic network for any evidence that humans were more than elaborately crafted folklore. By morning, he had convinced himself that this was an elaborate practical joke, possibly orchestrated by his academic rival, Professor Zilgax, who taught theoretical species evolution down the hall. Yes, that had to be it. Some costumed actors or advanced holograms would show up, he'd play along graciously, and then expose the prank in his next peer-reviewed publication, Attempted Hoaxes in Xenobiological Academia, a case study. He entered his classroom with renewed confidence, his scales now a determined burgundy shade. Good morning, eager minds, he announced to his students, who were already settled in their various seating apparatuses. Before we continue yesterday's fascinating exploration of humanity's anatomical impossibilities, I should inform you that we are allegedly expecting some human exchange students today. He performed exaggerated air quotes with his manipulator appendages, eliciting knowing chuckles from the class. When these humans arrive, he continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, I expect you all to behave with the utmost scientific curiosity, observe closely, take detailed notes. After all, it's not every day one encounters a walking, talking mythological creature. Zorn's gelatinous form rippled with excitement. Professor, will we be allowed to scan them? My sensory appendages were just upgraded last lunar cycle. By all means, Zorn. In fact, I encourage everyone to record this momentous occasion for posterity. Now let us begin where we left off yesterday. Professor Quibblix activated his holographic display, projecting a wildly inaccurate anatomical diagram of a human. It showed a being with bones apparently made of chalk, muscles that seemed randomly placed, and a brain half the size it should be. As you can see, the supposed skeletal structure of humans defies basic gravitational physics. The myths claim they balance their entire mass on just two narrow load-bearing limbs. Can you imagine? They would topple over at the slightest planetary breeze. The class chittered and buzzed with amusement, and Professor Quibblix was just warming to his favorite part about the inefficiency of human knees when the classroom door slid open. Three figures entered, and the room fell into absolute silence. They were bipedal, endoskeletal, 2 eyes, 2 arms, 2 legs, no visible auxiliary limbs, sensory organs or energy manipulation appendages, exactly as the myths had described. Professor Quibblix froze mid-gesture, his 4 eyes locked on the newcomers. One of his hearts actually stopped beating momentarily. Sorry we're late, said the tallest of the three, a being with dark skin and short, tightly curled hair. The gravitational adjustments in our quarters took longer than expected. I'm Jack Robinson, engineering specialist. Freya Odinsdottir, introduced the second, who had pale skin and long red hair tied back. Xenobiological researcher. And I'm Dax Nguyen, said the third, who appeared somewhat shorter with an olive complexion and an easy smile. Cultural liaison officer. We're the human exchange students. Hope we're not interrupting anything important. All 3 sets of human eyes moved simultaneously to the holographic display behind Professor Quibblix, which was still showcasing his absurdly incorrect human anatomy diagram. For exactly 4.3 seconds, Professor Quibblix remained utterly motionless, an eternity for his typically hyperactive species. Then all 7 of his mouthparts began speaking at once in a cacophony of academic panic. Welcome, that is to say, this diagram is merely the old texts where perspective is important in scientific. He finally regained control of himself, switching off the holographic display with a swift jerky movement. Welcome, distinguished exchange students, he managed, his scales rapidly cycling through colors before settling on a mortified mauve. How unexpected. We were just discussing some ancient theoretical texts on various bipedal species. Dax smiled broader. Were those supposed to be humans in that diagram? Because if so, I think I need to see a doctor immediately. My internal organs seem to be in all the wrong places. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the classroom. The students were collectively leaning forward in their seats, eye stalks extended, sensory organs dilated, recording appendages activated. Merely an outdated illustration, Professor Quibblix said smoothly, his academic survival instincts kicking in. Perhaps you 3 would like to introduce yourselves more fully to the class. As it happens, we are currently covering interspecies cultural exchange protocols. The lie was transparent, but the humans graciously nodded. Jack stepped forward. As I said, I'm Jack. I specialize in adapting human engineering principles to different gravitational environments. Been working on starship design for about 7 years now. Freya followed. I study comparative xenobiology with a focus on convergent evolution across different planetary systems. I'm particularly interested in how similar environmental pressures create similar adaptations across completely unrelated species. Dax completed the introductions, and I helped different species understand each other. Sort of a translator, but for cultural concepts rather than just language. Earth only joined the Galactic Registry about 15 years ago, so we're still the new kids on the block. Professor Quibblix's mind was racing faster than a quantum particle. 15 years. Earth was registered. These weren't actors. These were actual, factual, biological humans standing in his classroom, the very creatures he'd built his academic reputation on proving were mythological. Fascinating, he said weakly. Perhaps you could take seats. We have some adjustable ones in the back for various physiologies. As the humans made their way to the back of the classroom, Quibblix noticed something horrifying on his teaching console. It was still displaying his lecture notes. The next slide was titled, Human Intellectual Capacity, Why Tool Use Doesn't Equal Intelligence. He frantically swiped it away, accidentally bringing up human emotions, a convenient evolutionary fiction. Zorn's voice cut through his panic. Professor, shouldn't we update our understanding now that we have actual humans present? This is an incredible opportunity. Yes, opportunity, Quibblix echoed faintly. Class, perhaps today we should pivot to a student-led discussion. Who has questions for our guests? Every appendage, pseudopod, tentacle, and limb in the classroom shot up simultaneously. Trixna's 14 eye stalks all focused intensely on the humans. Is it true you only have one heart? How do you survive cardiac failure? Actually, replied Freya with scientific precision, our single heart is quite resilient, with multiple backup systems, and the ability to be restarted even after stopping. Gloop or Plex spoke next. Do you really ingest capsaicin for pleasure despite it causing pain? Dax laughed. You mean spicy food? Absolutely. Jack here can eat ghost peppers like they're candy. It's an acquired taste, Jack admitted. But there's something addictive about that burn. The questions continued rapid fire, and with each accurate, matter-of-fact answer, Professor Quibblix seemed to physically shrink behind his podium. His carefully constructed academic reality was disintegrating around him with every word the humans spoke. You sleep for 8 hours every day. You have domesticated predators living in your dwellings. Your young require years of protection before maturity. You really cannot regenerate severed limbs. Yes, we call them cats and dogs, and we love them. Unfortunately, human children are helpless for quite a while. Not yet, though our medical technology is working on it. Professor Quibblix watched in mounting horror as his students became increasingly fascinated with the humans. His carefully cultivated academic skepticism was being replaced with genuine scientific curiosity, the very thing he claimed to promote but had actually been suffocating with his dogmatic certainty. Worst of all, Zorn, his prize student, seemed to be taking detailed notes on everything the humans said, occasionally shooting disappointed glances toward Quibblix. When the class period ended, not a single student made a move to leave. They were too enthralled with the real-life mythological creatures answering their questions. Professor Quibblix cleared all 3 of his throats simultaneously, producing a sound like a malfunctioning air filtration system. That's all for today, class. Remember, next time we'll be discussing, well, something completely different from what I originally planned. Class dismissed. As the students reluctantly began to disperse, the three humans approached his podium, each wearing expressions that Quibblix's limited understanding of human facial cues couldn't quite interpret. Were they angry? Amused? About to initiate a diplomatic incident? Professor, said Jack, extending a hand in what Quibblix vaguely recognized as some sort of greeting gesture. We're looking forward to continuing this cultural exchange. Your class seems very informative. Indeed, Freya added, her eyes fixed on the now blank holographic projector, though we'd be happy to provide more accurate anatomical references if you'd find that helpful. Dax, the cultural liaison, simply smiled, a gesture that Professor Quibblix was beginning to find unsettling in its ambiguity. This has been illuminating for everyone, I think, Dax said. We'll see you tomorrow, Professor. Perhaps we could discuss human achievements in scientific methodology. I hear that's a fascinating topic. As the humans left the classroom, Professor Quibblix collapsed into his hovering chair, his scales now a defeated gray. He had exactly 24 hours to completely rewrite everything he thought he knew about humans, and somehow salvage what remained of his academic dignity. He was beginning to suspect this would indeed be the worst day of his professional career. Unfortunately, he was also beginning to suspect that tomorrow might be even worse. Professor Quibblix arrived early the next morning, having spent the entire night revising his curriculum. His scales were a pallid blue from exhaustion, but he felt reasonably prepared. He'd pivot from mythological humans to previously undocumented sentient species, a case study. Yes, that would preserve some dignity. The classroom filled quickly, with double the usual number of students. Word had spread. Due to recent revelations. Quibblix began stiffly. Today's lecture will cover the integration of new data into existing scientific frameworks. You mean how to admit you were completely wrong, came a voice from the doorway. The three humans entered, with Dax in front, smiling that unsettling smile. I prefer updating one's hypothesis based on new evidence, Quibblix replied, forcing his mouthparts into what he hoped resembled collegiality. Jack strode forward. Professor, we've been thinking, rather than just answering questions, how about we demonstrate some human capabilities? Give your students a more hands-on understanding. Quibblix's scales flickered nervously. That seems educational. Great. Jack clapped his hands together, a startlingly loud sound that made several gelatinous students ripple in alarm. Let's start with human endurance. Before Quibblix could object, Jack dropped to the floor and began performing what he called push-ups, elevating and lowering his entire body using only his upper limbs. After 50 repetitions without stopping, the class was buzzing with amazement. Our musculature may seem inefficient, Jack explained. Not even breathing hard. But we're persistence predators. We evolved to just keep going. Freya stepped forward next. You mentioned our supposed intellectual limitations yesterday, Professor. Mind if I demonstrate problem solving? She requested the most complex mathematical equation any student could devise. Zorn immediately offered a 7-dimensional probability matrix. Freya studied it briefly, then solved it using a completely unconventional approach that left even Quibblix speechless. Humans don't just solve problems, she explained. We often reframe them entirely. Our brains evolved for creative thinking, not just computational power. Dax's demonstration proved most devastating to Quibblix's remaining academic credibility. You stated humans adapt poorly to environmental changes, Dax said, casually examining the professor's notes. Let's test that. Dax requested volunteers to create challenging environmental conditions. Within minutes, the classroom had sections with triple gravity, near freezing temperatures, and even a small acid rain simulation. To Quibblix's mounting horror, Dax navigated each zone with minimal protective equipment, explaining human adaptability techniques as he went. We don't just survive, we improvise, overcome, and then write instruction manuals for the next humans, Dax concluded cheerfully. Zorn, who had been frantically taking notes throughout, finally raised a pseudopod. Professor, the star pupil bubbled, your published paper, The Evolutionary Implausibility of Human Intelligence, states that no species could develop advanced technology without inherent telepathic abilities or multiple manipulator limbs. Yet humans achieved space travel with just 2 hands and verbal communication. All eyes and sensory organs turned to Quibblix. Well, yes, he stammered. But that was based on the available evidence at the time. Which was what exactly? Jack asked innocently. Since we apparently didn't exist. Theoretical models, Quibblix protested. Evolutionary predictive frameworks, comparative xenobiology. So, guesswork, Freya translated, raising an eyebrow. The classroom erupted in a cacophony of multi-species laughter. Professor Quibblix's carefully constructed academic persona was collapsing faster than an unstable neutron star. Zorn delivered the final blow. "Professor, I've reviewed all the evidence presented today. I must conclude that your entire curriculum contains significant factual errors. I respectfully request a complete course revision with input from our human colleagues." The other students buzzed, chirped, and gurgled in agreement. Professor Quibblix looked around at his classroom, now in intellectual rebellion, then at the three humans who had single-handedly demolished his academic reputation in less than 2 hours. Dax offered him a sympathetic smile. "If it helps, Professor, humans have a long history of being completely wrong about things too. We call it the scientific method. The whole point is correcting mistakes when new evidence appears." For the first time in his career, Professor Quibblix found himself entirely speechless. His carefully constructed world of academic certainty had been utterly dismantled by creatures whose existence he had been denying just days ago, and judging by the growing crowd of curious faculty members now peering through the classroom doorway, his humiliation was only beginning. By mid-afternoon, Professor Quibblix's classroom had transformed into the hottest attraction on campus. Faculty members abandoned lectures. Students skipped exams. Even the notoriously reclusive librarian, Voxtel, had emerged from the quantum archives to witness the spectacle. "Is it true?" asked Professor Zilgax, Quibblix's academic rival, slithering into the overcrowded room. "Actual humans? In your mythological species class?" His scales rippled with barely contained glee. "We've reclassified the course," Quibblix muttered, his color a defeated beige. "It's now contemporary xenoanthropology." The humans, far from being bothered by the attention, seemed to be enjoying themselves immensely. They had turned the classroom into an impromptu cultural exhibition. Jack had disassembled and reassembled a standard galactic translator, improving its efficiency by 23% using only basic tools and what he called good old human ingenuity. "Humans don't just use technology," he explained to the amazed onlookers. "We can't help tinkering with it. It's practically a compulsion." Meanwhile, Freya had organized a comparative biology station where alien students were mapping similarities between their physiologies and human systems. "Convergent evolution is remarkable," she noted, showing a Mercurian student how human blood cells resembled their plasma nodules. Different paths, similar solutions. But it was Dax who truly brought chaos to the classroom with a demonstration of human culture. He had set up a small food synthesizer programmed with Earth recipes and was offering tastings. "This," he announced, holding up a small cup, "is what we call espresso. It's a beverage made from roasted ground seeds containing a mild stimulant called caffeine." Trixna, whose species had never evolved taste receptors, volunteered her eye-stalk appendage to analyze the liquid. All 14 eyes immediately dilated to maximum size. "By the cosmic void," she exclaimed, her normally monotone voice hitting unprecedented octaves. "It's like my neurons are dancing. Is this how humans feel all the time?" "Only after about 3 cups, Dax replied with a grin. Next came samples of chocolate, spicy salsa, and something Dax called sour gummy worms, that caused a near-religious experience for the energy-based students. Professor Quibblix watched in growing dismay as his orderly classroom descended into sensory chaos. Students were playing human music, apparently called rock and roll on improvised instruments. Others were attempting human dance movements, resulting in several minor gravitational incidents. Dean Vroxis crystallized into existence beside Quibblix. "This is remarkable. The entire university is buzzing about your class. The Galactic Education Council has already contacted me about expanding our human exchange program." "Wonderful," Quibblix mumbled, watching as Zorn attempted to form pseudopods into a thumbs-up gesture. "Oh, and your academic leave request was denied," the dean added cheerfully. "The council feels you're uniquely positioned to develop our human studies program, given your extensive theoretical background." Before Quibblix could protest, Jack announced the next demonstration, human humor. "Now a being walks into a cosmic tavern. The tavern keeper says, 'We don't serve your kind here.' The being replies, 'That's fine, I'm actually in the mood to serve myself.' The alien audience stared in confusion. "That's the setup. You see, serve has multiple meanings," Jack began explaining. "I don't understand," said one crystalline student. "Was the tavern experiencing staffing shortages?" Freya patted Jack's shoulder. "Humor's always the hardest to translate." "Let's try music instead," suggested Dax, producing a small device. "This is universal." The room filled with rhythmic sounds, what humans called a beat, and Dax began moving in synchronized patterns. Within minutes, students of various species were attempting to follow along, creating a multi-appendaged choreographic disaster. Professor Quibblix slumped against his hovering desk. His meticulously organized classroom, once a temple to academic order, now resembled what he imagined a human party might look like, based on the ancient texts he'd dismissed as exaggeration. "Professor," called Zorn excitedly, his gelatinous form vibrating in what appeared to be joy. "Did you know humans create art without practical purpose? They call it expression. I've been experimentally expressing my cellular satisfaction through color modulation." The once serious student was now pulsating in rainbow patterns that spelled out humans rock in ancient galactic standard. As Quibblix contemplated early retirement, Professor Zilgak slithered closer. Fascinating creatures, these humans. So improbable, yet so undeniably real. "I've already submitted a request to co-teach your new human studies program." "You've what?" Quibblix sputtered. "Someone needs to provide academic rigor." Zilgax replied smoothly. "After all, your expertise was in proving they don't exist." Quibblix's scales turned a dangerous crimson. This wasn't just academic embarrassment anymore. This was a hostile takeover of his intellectual territory. As the chaos around him intensified, someone was now attempting to synthesize something called pizza. Professor Quibblix made a decision. If his career was going to implode spectacularly, he would at least maintain some control over the explosion. His three hearts pounding in irregular synchrony, he slithered to the center of the room and raised all four appendages for attention. "Enough," he shouted, his voice modulator cranked to maximum volume. The room gradually quieted as all eyes, sensory organs and perception fields turned toward him. "These demonstrations have been informative," he managed, scales cycling through colors before settling on a determined purple. "But they prove nothing definitive about human capabilities. I propose a formal scientific evaluation, a controlled experiment, a true test." The three humans exchanged glances. "What kind of test?" asked Jack, crossing his arms. Professor Quibblix's mouth parts formed what might have been mistaken for a smile. "One that will determine, once and for all, whether humans truly belong in galactic academia, or if they are, as I initially classified them, simply an evolutionary fluke unworthy of serious study." The entire university gathered in the grand amphitheater for Professor Quibblix's definitive human capability assessment. Faculty members placed bets on the outcome. Students live-streamed to 7-star systems. Even the reclusive quantum physics department emerged from their temporal bubble to witness the event. Professor Quibblix stood on the central platform, briefly savoring his return to academic prominence before addressing the crowd. "Sentient beings of Galactic University. Today we conduct an empirical evaluation of human capabilities against established xenobiological standards." The three humans stood nearby, looking remarkably unconcerned. "I have designed 3 challenges that will conclusively demonstrate the limitations of human physiology and cognition," Quibblix continued. Challenge 1. Quantum probability calculation. A holographic projection appeared, displaying a complex 11-dimensional equation that typically required specialized neural implants to process. "Solve this without technological assistance," Quibblix instructed Freya, his scales smug. Freya studied the equation, then shrugged. "I can't." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Quibblix's mouth parts twisted into something resembling a triumphant smile. However, Freya continued. "Neither can you, Professor." "I beg your pardon," Quibblix sputtered. "This equation contains a deliberate error," Freya explained, pointing to a seemingly innocuous symbol. "The quantum entanglement factor is improperly expressed. It's mathematically impossible to solve." The university's head mathematician confirmed this with obvious embarrassment. The amphitheater erupted in amazed chittering. Quibblix's scales turned a mortified orange. Challenge 2. Environmental adaptation. A transparent chamber materialized, filled with a swirling Jovian atmosphere mixture lethal to most carbon-based life. "Survive in this environment for 5 minutes." Quibblix challenged Jack. Jack examined the chamber thoughtfully. "Interesting approach, Professor. But rather than proving human limitations, you're demonstrating them." He gestured toward the alien audience. "Most beings here couldn't survive that chamber either. That's why we all build technology." Jack removed a small device from his pocket and quickly assembled what appeared to be a compact breathing apparatus. "Humans don't conquer environments by evolving special adaptations," he explained, entering the chamber with his improvised gear. "We engineer solutions." For 5 excruciating minutes, Quibblix watched Jack calmly take readings of the toxic atmosphere while casually waving to the cheering crowd. By the time Jack emerged unharmed, Quibblix's scales had faded to a desperate gray. His academic reputation was evaporating faster than water on a neutron star. "Final challenge," he announced, his voice modulator cracking with strain. "The true measure of advanced intelligence, telepathic communication." He gestured dramatically to a secured container. "This box contains a classified concept. The cryptomind of Proxima Centauri has telepathically implanted it in my consciousness. No verbal or written hints will be provided. Dax must identify the concept, proving humans possess basic telepathic capabilities that any advanced species should have." The audience fell silent. Even Zorn looked concerned. Not even the most communicative species could extract specific concepts without established telepathic protocols. Dax approached the container, studied Quibblix for a moment, then smiled. "The concept is academic humility, something you've been learning the hard way, Professor." Quibblix's four eyes bulged simultaneously. That's correct. But how? Humans don't have telepathy." "We have something better," Dax replied. "We understand people. Your scales turn specific colors with specific emotions. Your eye movements follow predictable patterns when you're feeling smug. And honestly, what concept would be more poetically appropriate for this test?" It wasn't telepathy. It was psychology. The amphitheater exploded with sounds of amazement and appreciation. Students began chanting "Oh mans, humans" in various biological and mechanical vocalizations. Professor Quibblix stood frozen, his academic worldview completely shattered. His scales cycled rapidly through colors before settling on a blank, defeated white. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Everything I've taught, everything I've published." Dean Vroxis floated forward. "Perhaps it's time to acknowledge that your classification of humans was premature, Professor." Quibblix stared at the three humans who had systematically dismantled his academic reputation. They weren't showing triumph or mockery, just patient expectation. Something inside Professor Quibblix finally cracked. Years of academic certainty, scholarly arrogance, and rigid classification systems crumbled away like cosmic dust. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words feeling alien in all three of his throats. The amphitheater fell silent. "Humans aren't mythological. They're not evolutionary flukes. They're not inferior to telepathic or multi-limbed species. They're just different. And I failed to recognize that difference doesn't equal deficiency." Jack stepped forward and extended his hand, a human gesture of reconciliation. "That, Professor, is the most intelligent thing you've said since we arrived." As Quibblix hesitantly extended a manipulator appendage to shake Jack's hand, the crowd erupted in approval. Students began flooding the stage, questions flowing like cosmic radiation after a supernova. "Will humans join the quantum physics department? Can we establish cultural exchange programs on Earth? Would you consider co-authoring new xenobiological classifications?" Professor Quibblix found himself being pushed aside as the crowd swarmed the humans. His moment of scientific reckoning had been immediately overshadowed by the next academic rush, collaboration with the newly discovered species. He slithered to the edge of the stage, watching his carefully constructed academic empire collapse entirely, only to be replaced by something he hadn't experienced in decades. Curiosity. Genuine unbridled scientific curiosity. Professor Zilgax appeared beside him. "Quite the academic meltdown, Quibblix. Your reputation may never recover." "Perhaps," Quibblix replied slowly, his scales settling into a thoughtful blue. "That's exactly what needed to happen." One academic quarter later, Professor Quibblix stood before a packed lecture hall. His scales had settled into a new default color, a thoughtful teal that his students had begun to associate with his reformed teaching approach. "Welcome to advanced xenoanthropology. Challenging our assumptions," he began, activating a holographic display that showed the infamous incorrect human anatomy diagram side by side with an accurate one. "Today we examine the evolutionary advantages of being wrong." The class, triple the size of his former Mythological Species course, contained students from 17 different species, including 2 new human exchange students. In the front row sat Jack, Freya, and Dax, who had extended their stay to help establish the university's first human studies department. "Scientific progress," Quibblix continued, "doesn't come from being right. It comes from recognizing when we're wrong and adapting accordingly. A lesson I learned rather publicly." Appreciative laughter rippled through the classroom. His academic humiliation had become something of a campus legend, and surprisingly had made him more popular than ever. "Professor," called out Zorn, still his most engaged student, "the chemical analysis of human endorphin production during their humor practice is complete." The results suggest their enjoyment of being wrong has evolutionary advantages. Excellent work, Zorn, Quibblix replied. Perhaps that explains why humans have embraced failure as a stepping stone rather than an endpoint. Their phrase trial and errors contains profound wisdom that many telepathic species miss entirely. After class, Dean Vroxis crystallized beside Quibblix's desk. Your department's application for expanded funding has been approved. The Galactic Education Council was particularly impressed with your new textbook. She gestured to a holographic display showing previously mythological, a new approach to xenobiological classification by Professor Quibblix, with contributions from J. Robinson, F. Odensdottir, and D. Nguyen. It had already become the standard text in comparative xenobiology programs across 3 quadrants. Who would have thought, the dean mused, that admitting you were catastrophically wrong would lead to your greatest academic success. Later that evening, Professor Quibblix slithered into the faculty lounge where the 3 humans waited with a bubbling concoction. We're celebrating, explained Jack, handing Quibblix a specially designed container. Our cultural exchange program just got approved. 50 alien students will visit Earth next semester. Including Zorn, added Freya. His research proposal on human emotional expression was unanimously accepted. Quibblix accepted the drink cautiously. What is this? Something called champagne, Dax replied with a grin. Humans consume it when celebrating achievements. We've adapted it to your biochemistry. To being wrong, Quibblix proposed, raising his container in the human gesture he'd learned. To being wrong, the humans echoed, clinking their glasses against his. As the peculiar earth beverage created a not unpleasant tingling in all 3 of his throats, Professor Quibblix reflected on the strange path his career had taken. His most significant academic contribution had come not from proving others wrong, but from admitting he himself had been mistaken. The following day, students filing into Quibblix's lecture hall were greeted by a new sign above the door. Written in both Standard Galactic and English, it read, "The beginning of wisdom is the statement I do not know." Below it in slightly smaller text, "Especially about humans."